Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Thanks for joining me again. We're still talking about sympathetic nervous system. I'd like to go back to our chart and try to fill in a few details here. So when we talk about the organization, we're going to talk about a short preganglionic neuron. And it's located in the lateral gray horns of T1 to L2. So remember, we can talk about it as the thoracolumbar system. And then we had the long ganglionic neuron. And this is going to be located in either the sympathetic chain, the collateral, or the adrenal medulla. I'm going to write that as the plural form, and I'm going to highlight it because remember when we talked about the adrenal medullae, we said there were several things that were different. So one thing that was different was in this case, you had a long preganglionic neuron and you had a short ganglionic neuron. And then we also talked about the release of the neurotransmitter as going into the bloodstream. So we said, it's actually more like a hormone. And so this is kind of like our short to the point summary chart. And remember, there were more details on chain, sympathetic chain, collateral, and adrenal medullae ganglia. So make sure that you're doing that review as well. When we talk about neurotransmitters, there are three primary ones. So we're going to see the release of acetylcholine. Now, this is our old friend. We talked about it quite a lot in Anatomy and Physiology Part 1. And remember, we can abbreviate acetylcholine with big A, big C, little h. New to the story is epinephrine. And epinephrine can be abbreviated with a capital E. Now, epinephrine can also be referred to as adrenaline. So if you're familiar with that, that's what we're talking about. And then norepinephrine is the other key neurotransmitter that's part of our conversation in the sympathetic division. And we can abbreviate norepinephrine as capital N, capital E. So if we take a look back at our diagram that we drew out before, what we're going to see happening is at the synapse between the ganglionic, the preganglionic neuron and the ganglionic neuron, at those ganglia, we're going to get the release here of acetylcholine. So what this is telling us is it's that preganglionic neuron that releases acetylcholine. And it's the ganglionic neuron that has a receptor for acetylcholine. Okay, so that's always where that's happening. If you wanted to, you could add that in our notes up here. So we could just say release acetylcholine. Now, when it comes to that black ganglionic neuron that we've drawn in and we said, okay, is synapsing onto the effector tissues, which are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, adipose tissue, and glands, it is the ganglionic neuron that's then releasing the epinephrine or the norepinephrine. So I'm putting both of those there. And then we've already mentioned that the epinephrine and the norepinephrine are going to be released as hormones by that adrenal medullae. And so I'm going to highlight like everything about that drawing that we've done there. So make sure you're paying attention to that. Now, when we talk about a neurotransmitter or hormone, both of these are chemical messengers that are being released. And in order for a target tissue or an effector tissue to respond, that tissue has to have certain type of receptor as part of its cell membrane. That receptor has to have a certain type of receptor as part of its cell membrane. So what we're saying here is the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, the adipose tissue in the glands can't hear, if you want to think of it that way, epinephrine or norepinephrine unless they have the special type of receptors. right? And this is true for hormones as well. The difference, remember, between a hormone and a neurotransmitter is the neurotransmitter is released at the synapse, whereas the hormone is released into the bloodstream. So synapses communication means it's very direct, it's very specific, it's very localized, whereas a hormone distributed through the bloodstream is a longer lasting and widespread. Okay. So going back to this conversation about receptors, the receptors are part of the membrane of the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, the adipose tissue, and the glands. This is giving autonomy to your cells. Your cells are making their cell membrane. They're making these receptors. So essentially, the cell decides whether it responds to epinephrine or norepinephrine and how it responds. Like, is it going to be stimulated or is it going to be inhibited by these signals, right? It's up to the cell. It's up to the cell. And so when we talk about these receptors that are involved in the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to say that these receptors are classified as either alpha or beta receptors. And these are Greek letters. So I've written out the symbols for the Greek letter alpha and the Greek letter beta. Let's go ahead and go back to our chart. And in the case of these alpha and beta receptors, we talk about this as adrenergic system because we are responding to epinephrine and norepinephrine, and epinephrine's other name is adrenaline. So when we say adrenergic, we're referring to that adrenaline. And so we're going to see that we have alpha receptors and we have beta receptors here. Now, these alpha and beta receptors are both going to be classified as G protein coupled receptors, meaning we've seen this before, right? Meaning there's the neurotransmitter epinephrine or norepinephrine binds, and then you activate or deactivate the G protein, and the G protein in turn is activating a second messenger, and the second messenger actually makes the change in the cell, right? So we talked about that before. When we talk about your alpha and your beta, is more nuanced, right? So we've said that each cell gets to make its own receptors, and there's two types of alpha cells, and there's two types of alpha receptors, and there's three types of beta receptors. And let's go into that just a little bit of detail here. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you that your alpha mostly pairs with norepinephrine, and your beta mostly pairs with epinephrine, but actually alpha can bind with either norepinephrine or epinephrine, and beta can bind with either epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay. All right, y'all, I wanted to go a little bit more into the different types of alpha and different types of beta receptors, just so you get this idea of the nuance of what's going on in this sympathetic nervous system. And I needed a little bit more room. So we're looking here at the adrenergic receptors of the sympathetic nervous system. They come in two broad categories, either alpha or beta. And remember, there is an alpha 1 and an alpha 2. When we talk about the alpha 1, we're going to see this located on smooth muscle cells, and it's going to be excitatory. So if our norepinephrine binds to an alpha 1 receptor, it's found on the smooth muscle, and it's exciting or causing that smooth muscle to contract. The alpha 2 receptor is going to be found on sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. And so I think all I'm going to say here is it's going to help to coordinate responses between sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. So that's not really telling us like where they are exactly, but more like the significance of these. And then when we look at the beta, remember we have 3 types here. So we have beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. And when we talk about beta 1, we're going to see this on skeletal muscle. And we're going to see this on cardiac muscle. And it's going to be excitatory. Some of you maybe have heard of medications, a class of medications called beta blockers that can be prescribed for individuals with problems regulating their blood pressure. And so it's blocking the beta 1 receptors so that you're not increasing the heart rate. You're not exciting that cardiac muscle. Your beta 2 is going to inhibit smooth muscle. So we've seen that if your smooth muscle cells have alpha 1 and you're releasing epinephrine or epinephrine, that smooth muscle is going to be excited. If your smooth muscle has beta 2 and you're releasing epinephrine or epinephrine, that smooth muscle will be inhibited. So an example here might be the beta 2 receptors might be found on smooth muscle in the digestive tract, whereas the alpha 1 receptors might be found on the smooth muscle in the blood vessels going to the digestive tract. We want to constrict the blood flow to the digestive tract while also inhibiting the activity of the digestive tract. Or we might see the beta 2 on blood vessels going out to your extremities so that that muscle relaxes, so that those blood vessels are larger so that you increase your blood flow, right? So the nuance is what I want you to be paying attention to here. This beta 3 is going to be found on adipocytes, which are your cells of your adipose tissue, your fat storage tissue, and it's going to stimulate the breakdown of triglycerides. Remember, we mentioned that you're going to reduce your energy reserves, meaning you're going to be pulling out and using that stored energy. And so that's what we're talking about here. All right, y'all. Just taking a look over my notes, making sure I hit all the highlights. I have done so for sympathetic nervous system. Stay tuned for the parasympathetic nervous system. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.